Hi, I'm Daniel Hidalgo, the Director of Education for the Idaho Art Lab, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this beginner's clay lesson. I hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoy teaching you. So we'll start off with, what is clay? And basically, clay is made up of the same stuff that the earth is made up of. So, but what makes clay special is that although it's the same materials as the Earth's crust, it's been ground up and eroded down to very, very teeny tiny particles. And when it's in these really small particles, when it's mixed with water, it'll actually be suspended. And it gives us some really unique properties called plasticity, which allows us to mold it and pinch it and bend it, and it holds its shape. And these unique properties is what makes clay such a useful material for us humans. So the clay that we're using is a sculptural clay, and it has a little bit of grog and a little bit of sand added into it, and that makes it better for sculpture because those particles are much bigger than the clay particles. And when the water evaporates out of the clay doesn't shrink up so much, and it helps save us from having cracks and other problems. So this is a really good clay for sculpture, and it's a really good clay for us to be using. Some of the tools that you're going to need are a place to work, a nice hard surface. I'm using a canvas wrap board. You can get an old tablecloth or something like that. Be thinking about your cleanup, because you don't want to be making a big mess and making it hard for other people to deal with your clay project. So if you can, be thinking about your cleanup before you ever begin, that's a good start. This is a water-based clay, so it has really easy soap and water cleanup. And if you have a little bit of clay residue left over, you can take care of that with like a vinegar wash. So great user-friendly stuff to use. Some of the tools I like to have on hand are first and foremost, a little bit of water, because the clay is suspended in water, and we add water to it. It helps its plasticity and helps its gluing ability, sticking together. But probably my favorite tool is just a wooden stick and my own hands. Sometimes you have a small, pointy, sharp stick like a toothpick, or maybe an old pencil. The eraser is kind of hard on it, and you don't really care about writing with it anymore. The pencil makes a really good tool. An older paintbrush, so you don't care getting dirty. These are really nice for applying a little bit of water where you need it. And then probably my favorite tool is an old toothbrush. And the toothbrush is great because it can apply a little bit of water, but the bristles allow you to scratch and score the clay, and that's a real useful property when you're adding pieces of clay together. Hand building. Now, hand building, there's about 4 basic things that we can do with hand building, and when you do your designs, there's multiple ways to use these together to make your sculpture. The first one is making a ball. And so first you'll just take a chunk of clay and you'll get it in your hand and roll it between your palms, and you'll start to get a ball shape. Now that's not a perfectly round ball shape, but if you play with it and squeeze it and eyeball it a little bit, you can get a pretty nice little round ball out of that. And as we practice, we get better and better at it, and you can make those almost identical sizes. And if you need to make them a little bit smaller, you can make a little bit smaller balls. And then pick up your clay and get it like that. Now, in hand building, I like to say there's a rule of thumb: no thicker than your thumb. And my thumb's pretty big, and if I were to put that on a ruler, it's just about an inch. So don't make anything thicker than an inch. What happens is, if I have this big ball, you can see it's thicker than my thumb. This big ball will actually trap moisture on the inside. And when we go to the firing process, that water cannot escape, but the heat will want to turn it to steam. and it'll actually make the little clay ball explode. And that'll ruin your sculpture. It'll probably ruin the sculpture next to it. So, rule of thumb, no thicker than your thumb. So if you have a piece that's nice and thick like this, you can take one of your tools and pierce it and give it a little breather hole. And that allows the clay from the inside to get out, and I still have a nice good sized ball for my sculpture. The next hand building technique is making a coil. So you can make a coil out of the clay simply by rolling it with your palms. And this takes a little practice because sometimes you'll get it and it'll kind of thud and won't. But with a little practice you can get it, and you can get it to where it's rolled just like your pencil. And the coil can be used in a lot of decorative ways. Take a lump of clay, start it in your palms, put it on your surface. And what I like to do is, you'll notice this is a perpendicular motion to the clay, and I start to get finger grooves. So if I turn my fingers at a slight diagonal, it takes those finger grooves out of the clay, and my coil starts to get really nice. But if I just go perpendicular, pretty soon I get those little finger grooves. So remember to keep your hands in motion when making your coils. The next useful technique in hand building is a slab. And that's basically just squishing your clay flat. And you can use a rolling pin, or you can use a heavy block of wood or something to squish your clay, or you can just use your palm and you just take a nice easy push. Now, there's one thing to remember when doing a slab, and that is you need to flip it over and squish the other side. Why would you do that? If I don't, I've only compressed the one side, and when the clay dries, it will want to curl in the drying process. So, by squishing it and then turning it over and giving the other side a good squish, I have now compressed both sides of the clay, and that will help it dry so that it doesn't curl on you. Also, you can get a nice smoother texture by checking how your press is. Now I have a nice slab, and this slab can be used in lots of different ways. I can grab my favorite little wood stick and I can cut little pieces off of here, and now I go from a slab to a nice ribbon that could be used in conjunction with my coils maybe, or I can use it to make really fun shapes. And I've got me a little heart shape here. So, slab is extremely useful in your hand building. The last one is just pinching. And you can use just your index finger and your thumb, and you can pinch the clay and you can mold it and you can manipulate it and do what you want to do. One of the most basic lessons is what they call a pinch pot. And you can make bowl shapes by using your thumb and your fingers, by starting with a ball, finding a good center spot, stick your thumb in. And now what I'm looking at is I'm looking to see if I've got equal amount of clay around the hole. And I just take my finger and my thumb and I go around with a nice pinching motion between my thumb and my fingers. And I create a nice bowl shape. Now, unfortunately in this lesson we're not making bowls or cups or mugs. We are making a sculpture, but I could use this shape. I could flip it upside down and I have a nice, maybe a turtle shell, or maybe it's the dress to a lady. So you can use these for a lot of different techniques or to make things that look like something else. And these are your basic hand building techniques to use in your sculpture. Now, if I'm going to join two pieces of clay together, I need to do something they call scoring and slipping, or slipping and scoring, whichever you like to say. But it basically means we're gluing the clay together so that it's strong. Now, if I took this piece of clay and I took this piece of clay and I just stuck them together, they stick together, but they're not strong, and I can pull that apart. It's kind of like taking your two fists and sticking them together. You can see how the knuckles line up? Well, it wants to stick, but it's not very strong. And when the water evaporates, it's going to fall apart. But if we score and slip the clay, so I'm going to put that clay right here. I'm going to scratch it. And I'm going to add my water. That's the score, and then this is the slip. I can also use the toothbrush. Like I told you, this is a really handy tool. It will get my clay wet and it scratches it at the same time. Now when I put this clay together, it really sticks. And if you were to look at the clay microscopically, those scratches come together like this. And then when the water evaporates, it's hard and stuck together. All right, I'd like to talk about some of the problems you might encounter when making your sculpture. So you can see here I've created a little creature monster, and he's got some teeth and his eyes and his tongue sticking out here. But you may notice that I've got these cracks in the clay. And the cracks in your clay will start to happen when it goes from being a soft clay to a leather hard clay, and then as you bend it and move it, it'll start to crack. And so basically it's saying that it needs a little more moisture. So the way to add moisture to your clay is generally just dip 2 fingers in, add a little moisture to your hands, maybe just dip a thumb and take a look at that crack and just add a little bit of moisture and then just start smoothing. Now, if it gets glossy smooth, that's actually turning the clay into slip. And that too much water can make your sculpture soft. But as you can see, I'm working that clay and I'm smoothing it just ever so gently. It takes a little bit of pressure and a little bit of moisture, but you can work out those problem areas with a little bit of patience. Another problem is what if I don't get done and I want to work on it tomorrow? If I leave this out overnight, it's going to dry as hard as a rock and it's going to be not workable anymore. So you've got to take care of your project so that it'll be ready there for you tomorrow. Get a little spray bottle, add just a little bit of moisture, just a misting. Not so much that it starts to fall apart, but just a little bit of moisture. And then just an old grocery sack, something that'll keep the air from getting on it. Gently place it in your plastic. Gently place it in your plastic and gently seal it off. You can tie it in a knot. Sometimes what I do is I just give it some good twists and then set that underneath the sculpture. But we basically want to protect it from the outside air drying it out. And that should keep it safe overnight so that you can finish your project tomorrow. All right, finally I want to talk about the different properties or the physical properties of clay. And what we have here is clay in different levels of dryness. And if you want to start at the beginning, and I take this piece of soft clay, this is soft and it's malleable, easy to use, and I add a lot of water to it. As you remember, we called it slip and score. If I add the water to it, the clay gets really slick and glossy. That is a layer of slip on there. So the slip is not really that beneficial when we're hand building other than gluing. If you're working on your project and it starts to get glossy and slimy and sticky, you're using too much water. And a lot of times when we're working on our sculptures, we don't need much more water than just dipping your fingers in the water, rubbing that water on your hands, and that amount of moisture is about the right amount of moisture for working your soft clay. Once again, if it's getting slick and shiny, it's got too much slip, and you know, water's your frenemy. You have to have it. It's your friend, but too much water makes your clay soft, it makes your project sag, and it can be your enemy too. So keep an eye on the amount of water because it's important in your clay. So we have soft clay, which is the soft, malleable, easy to work clay. After the clay has sat out a while, the water starts to evaporate and the clay becomes more firm. This firm clay is a lot stronger, and if I was going to build up on top of this clay, when it was soft, if I put something on top of here, it might collapse. But I left this out for a while, this starts to become pretty strong. And you can see that I can take almost a whole other pound of clay and put it on top of there, and it's strong enough to hold that up now that it's leather hard. That's a really good working stage of clay. Then you're going to finish your project and you're going to let it dry. And you're going to let it dry until it's what we call bone dry. This is the next stage. A bone dry piece of clay is very light because the water is out of it, and it's very fragile because the clay particles are just hanging in there together nice and loose. An example of that is this little disc that I have here that is a bone dry piece of clay. And as you can see, it's very fragile and it breaks. Be very careful with your sculptures in this stage because this is where you could make or break it. So after we have it in this and there's no more moisture in it, we put it in the kiln and we can fire it. And we fire it at such a high temperature that it absolutely positively bakes all the rest of the moisture out, and the clay particles shrink in and they line up and they become very strong. This final bisque piece of sculpture is now ready for paint. And you may notice that this cute little dragon has a hollow tummy because rule of thumb, no thicker than your thumb. It allows the water to come out. And when we fire it, it becomes very strong so that you can use it. So when it's bone dry, this is called greenware. And then after it's been fired, it's called bisque. And I'd like to thank Haven Christensen for letting us use her little sculpture.